Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you soothing tales to unwind your day. Tonight's story is the Hearthkeeper story, a relaxing bedtime novel to wrap you in warmth and peace. Settle in, get cozy, and let the journey begin. A fire rekindled. The wind howled through the valley, a low, mournful sound that rattled the shutters of the Hearthkeeper's inn. Inside, the world was warm and quiet. The fire crackled in the large stone hearth, its golden light flickering over the worn wooden beams of the ceiling. Martha sat at the long oak table near the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The diary before her lay open, its pages waiting to be filled. She picked up the pen, hesitating for a moment before letting the words spill onto the page. January 3rd. The snow came again today, blanketing the pines in thick, white silence. It's been weeks since a guest passed through the inn. I can't blame them. The road is treacherous this time of year, and most prefer the safety of the village. I've grown used to the stillness, but tonight it feels heavier. The inn was meant to be filled with voices, with laughter. Sometimes the quiet feels too much like absence. Martha set the pen down and gazed out the window. The world outside was a soft, snowy blur. The hills and trees shrouded in white. The inn had been her home for 20 years, a place she and her husband had built together from the ground up. But now, with him gone, it felt too large, too empty. She was about to close the diary when a faint sound broke through the silence, the crunch of boots on snow. Martha's heart quickened. She rose from her seat and crossed to the door, pulling it open just as a figure emerged from the swirling snow. "Hello?" she called, her voice carrying over the wind. The man stepped closer, his coat dusted with snow, his face ruddy from the cold. He carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, and his breath came in visible puffs. "Evening," he said, his voice rough but kind. "I was told there's an inn here. Have I found it?" "You have," Martha replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in before you freeze." The man stamped the snow from his boots and entered, letting the warmth of the fire wash over him. Martha took his coat and offered him a seat by the hearth. "Tea? Or something stronger?" she asked. "Tea would be perfect," he replied, holding his hands out to the fire. "Thank you." As Martha prepared the tea, she studied him from the corner of her eye. He looked to be in his 40s, with a ruggedness that suggested he was no stranger to the outdoors. His satchel, worn and weathered, rested at his feet. "What brings you out here in this weather?" she asked, setting the mug before him. "Work," he said with a small smile. "I'm a writer. Needed a quiet place to think, and someone in the village mentioned your inn." "A writer," Martha repeated, intrigued. "What kind of stories do you write?" "Travel stories, mostly," he said, his smile widening. "Adventures, faraway places, though lately I've been thinking more about the quiet journeys, the ones closer to home." As the evening wore on, the writer, who introduced himself as Daniel, shared tales of his travels. He spoke of mountains that pierced the sky, deserts that stretched endlessly to the horizon, and bustling cities filled with life. His words painted vivid pictures, and for the first time in months the inn felt alive again. "You've seen so much," Martha said, pouring him a second cup of tea. "What brings you to a place like this?" "Sometimes it's not about what's out there," Daniel said, gesturing to the snowy world beyond the window. "Sometimes it's about what you find when you stop moving." Martha nodded, his words resonating deeply. The inn had been her anchor, a place of stillness in a world that often felt too fast. Yet She hadn't realized how much she longed for the stories that people brought with them, the way they breathed life into the quiet. As the night deepened, Daniel asked about the inn's history. Martha hesitated for a moment before sharing how she and her husband had built it together, how it had been their dream to create a haven for travelers. "And now?" Daniel asked gently. "Now it's just me," Martha said, her voice soft. "But the inn still stands, waiting for its next story." Daniel smiled. "It sounds like it's found a good caretaker." That night, after Daniel had retired to his room, Martha sat by the hearth, her diary open before her. She picked up the pen and began to write. January 3rd, later. Tonight, the inn felt alive again. A writer named Daniel arrived, his stories filling the space like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. He reminded me of why this place exists, not just as a shelter, but as a home for the stories we carry with us. Perhaps this winter won't feel so quiet after all. Martha closed the diary and looked into the fire, its embers glowing softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, the warmth of the hearth and the promise of new stories filled her with quiet hope. Snowfall and secrets. The morning after Daniel's arrival, the world was cloaked in silence. Snow had continued to fall through the night, blanketing the trees and covering the roads. Martha stood at the window with a steaming mug of tea, watching as the first pale light of dawn touched the hills. The air was crisp, and the pines stood like sentinels against the white expanse. She heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, followed by the low creak of the floorboards. Turning, she saw him enter the room, his satchel slung over one shoulder. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "Seems we've been snowed in." Martha smiled. "Good morning. I'd say the inn makes for a better refuge than the road." "I'll take that as a blessing," Daniel replied, setting his satchel down near the hearth. "Do you ever tire of the quiet here?" "Not usually," Martha said, glancing back out the window. "But I'll admit, it's nice to have company now and then." After breakfast, Daniel settled by the fire with a notebook, his pen moving steadily over the pages. Martha busied herself with small tasks, tidying the kitchen, polishing the wooden banister, and straightening the bookshelves near the hearth. But every so often, her gaze drifted to Daniel, curious about the stories he was weaving. By mid-morning, the sound of voices outside broke the quiet. Martha peeked out the window and saw two figures approaching through the snow. A young man and woman, both bundled in heavy coats and scarves. The woman clung to the man's arm, her steps careful as they made their way up the path. Martha opened the door just as they reached it, their faces flushed from the cold. "Welcome," she said, ushering them inside. "Come in before you freeze." The young man helped the woman out of her coat, revealing her pale complexion and tired eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "We've been traveling for hours. The snow was worse than we expected." Martha led them to the fire, where Daniel set aside his notebook to make room. The woman, who introduced herself as Clara, sank into the chair with a grateful sigh. Her husband, Henry, stood close by, his expression hovering between concern and exhaustion. "You've had a rough journey?" Martha said, pouring them both cups of tea. "What brings you out in this weather?" "We were on our way to my family's home," Henry said, "but the roads are impassable. We saw the inn and hoped you might have room." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Martha replied, her voice kind. As the tea warmed them, Clara's color began to return, but her quiet demeanor didn't escape Martha's notice. She seemed distant, her gaze often drifting to the fire, while Henry spoke for them both. It was clear there was more to their story than a snowstorm. That evening, as snow continued to fall outside, the four of them gathered around the hearth. Daniel, ever the storyteller, began to share tales from his travels, his voice weaving images of far-off deserts, bustling marketplaces, and mountain peaks that touched the clouds. Clara listened with a faint smile, but her eyes remained shadowed. When Daniel paused to refill his cup, she finally spoke. "Have you ever traveled somewhere to escape?" she asked softly. Daniel tilted his head, considering her question. "I think we all do, in some way," he said. "Sometimes we travel to see what's out there. Other times we travel to leave something behind." Clara nodded, her hands tightening around her cup. Henry reached for her hand, his expression a mix of worry and tenderness. Later, as Martha prepared their room for the night, Clara lingered in the doorway. Her voice was hesitant when she finally spoke. "This place," she said, looking around the cozy room. "It feels safe." "That's what it's meant to be," Martha replied, smoothing the quilt on the bed. "A shelter for anyone who needs it." Clara hesitated, then said, "Henry and we lost our child not long ago. He wanted us to visit my family, to surround ourselves with people who could help us heal. But I wasn't ready." Martha paused, her heart aching for the young woman. "Grief has its own pace," she said gently. "You don't have to rush it." Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for giving us a place to rest." "You're welcome here for as long as you need," Martha said. The next morning, the snow began to ease, and the sky brightened with the promise of clear weather. Over breakfast, Clara's demeanor had softened, her laughter joining Henry's as they chatted with Daniel. The warmth of the inn seemed to wrap around them all, offering a reprieve from the heaviness they carried. When they finally prepared to leave, Clara hugged Martha tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the tea, the fire, and everything." Martha smiled, her heart full. "Safe travels, and take care of each other." As she watched them disappear down the snow-covered path, Martha returned to the hearth, her diary waiting on the table. She picked up her pen and wrote, "January 8th. Today the inn welcomed Henry and Clara, a young couple weighed down by grief. They reminded me that everyone carries a story, some heavier than others. I hope the warmth of this place gave them a moment of peace. In their presence I felt the same, a reminder of the strength we find in shared kindness." The fire crackled softly as Martha closed the diary. Outside, the snow glittered in the morning light, and inside the quiet felt lighter now, like an old friend rather than a burden. The Hearthkeeper's inn had done what it was meant to do. It had offered solace, if only for a little while. The Lone Piper. The snow began to thaw as January stretched on, leaving glistening patches of ice on the forest path and muddy tracks leading up to the inn. The mornings were quieter now, with the occasional drip of melting icicles breaking the silence. Martha kept herself busy, tending to the hearth and sweeping away the last traces of snow from the porch. The days felt slower, but not unpleasant. The solitude of the inn, once heavy, now carried a certain tranquility. It was on one such quiet evening, just as the last light of the sun dipped behind the hills, that Martha heard it. A low, haunting melody carried on the wind. She froze, her broom still in hand, and tilted her head to listen. The sound grew clearer, unmistakable now, the mournful tune of bagpipes. Setting the broom aside, she stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the soft hues of twilight. A figure appeared at the bend of the road, silhouetted against the snow. He carried a small pack slung over one shoulder, and his other hand held the pipes from which the melody poured. Martha waited until he was close enough to greet. "Good evening," she called, her voice warm despite her curiosity. "Are you passing through?" The man stopped, lowering the bagpipes and brushing snow from his coat. "Evening to you," he said, his accent thick with the rolling tones of the Highlands. "I was, but the road's gotten long, and the night's coming fast. Is there room for a weary piper at your inn?" "Always," Martha replied with a smile. "Come in and warm yourself." The man introduced himself as Hamish, a traveling musician who wandered from village to village, playing his pipes for whatever coin or kindness people offered. He had a weathered look about him, his coat patched in places and his boots worn from miles of travel. Yet there was an energy in his eyes, a spark that spoke of a deep connection to his music and the land. Martha offered him a seat by the fire and a plate of stew, which he accepted with gratitude. As he ate, he told her of his journeys, of cold nights spent under the stars, of villages where the music was met with cheers, and of others where the silence weighed heavier than the snow. "And you?" Hamish asked after a while, his voice soft. "Do you play?" Martha shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "Not anymore. My husband played the piano, and I used to sing with him, but it's been years since I've touched the keys." Hamish tilted his head thoughtfully. "Music's like an old friend," he said. "Even if you don't see it for a while, it's always there when you come back." After dinner, Hamish brought out his pipes again, settling near the hearth as he began to play. The music filled the room, its haunting tones weaving through the wooden beams and settling into the walls. Martha closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. It spoke of wide-open spaces, of wind-swept hills and misty mornings, and of a longing that felt both ancient and familiar. When the tune ended, Martha opened her eyes to find Hamish watching her. "It's a song of the Highlands," he said, his voice low, "a reminder of where I come from." "It's beautiful," Martha said, her words barely above a whisper. "It feels like it carries the land with it." Hamish nodded, his gaze distant. "That's what music does. It carries pieces of us, even when we don't realize it." The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the frosted windows, Martha found Hamish standing near the piano in the corner of the sitting room. His fingers brushed over the keys, their surfaces dulled by years of disuse. "This is yours?" he asked. "It was my husband's," Martha replied, her voice steady but soft. "We used to play together. He'd play the melodies, and I'd follow with the harmony. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to touch it." Hamish studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Would you let me play it?" Martha hesitated, but then gestured for him to sit. Hamish lifted the lid carefully, his hands moving over the keys with a familiarity that spoke of years spent with music. He began to play a slow, lilting tune, the notes filling the room with warmth and light. It wasn't perfect. The piano was slightly out of tune, and Hamish's touch was more accustomed to pipes than keys. But it was beautiful all the same. As the music flowed, Martha felt something shift inside her. It was as if a door she had kept closed for too long was opening, letting in the light and air she hadn't realized she needed. That evening, as Hamish prepared to leave, he handed Martha a piece of paper. "It's the song I played this morning," he said. "The notes, as best as I can remember them. It's yours now." Martha accepted the paper, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for the music and the reminder." Hamish smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You don't need to thank me. The music was always yours. After Hamish left, Martha sat by the fire with her diary open before her. She stared at the blank page for a long moment before picking up her pen. January 15th. Tonight, the inn was filled with music again. Hamish, a piper with stories etched into his soul, reminded me of what I had forgotten, that music is more than sound. It's memory, connection, and a bridge to the parts of ourselves we've left behind. Tomorrow, I think I'll try the piano, not because it's easy, but because it's time. The fire crackled softly, its glow reflecting off the worn surface of the piano in the corner. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the forest in quiet. But inside the Hearthkeeper's inn, a new melody was beginning to take shape. Warmth for a stranger? The winter storm arrived suddenly, blanketing the valley in a relentless cascade of snow. By midday, the sky was an endless sheet of white, and the forest path leading to the Hearthkeeper's inn was nearly invisible beneath the drifts. Inside, Martha added another log to the fire, the flames roaring to life as she rubbed her hands together for warmth. The day felt heavier than usual, the silence outside almost too complete. As she sat with her diary, pen poised above the page, a noise cut through the quiet, a faint, uneven thud. She froze, listening intently. There it was again, louder this time. Rising from her chair, she wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and opened the door. A figure staggered toward her through the snow, half collapsed and clutching at their side. Martha gasped and hurried out to meet them, the icy wind biting at her face. "Help," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. Martha slipped an arm around him, her strength surprising even herself as she guided him toward the warmth of the inn. His boots dragged through the snow, leaving a jagged trail behind them. Once inside, Martha eased the man into a chair near the hearth. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he tried to speak. "Don't try to talk," Martha said firmly, draping a blanket over him. "Let's get you warm first." She set a pot of water on the fire and fetched her first aid kit, her movements brisk but steady. The man's coat was soaked, and as she helped him out of it, she noticed the deep gash along his side, the fabric torn and crusted with blood. "You've been injured," she said, her tone softening. "Let me take care of this." He nodded weakly, his eyes half closed as Martha worked. She cleaned the wound with warm water and applied a salve, her hands deft and practiced. The man winced but said nothing, his head lolling back against the chair. "What happened?" she asked once she'd wrapped the wound in clean bandages. "Got caught in the storm," he said hoarsely, "slipped onto something sharp." "You're lucky you found the inn," Martha replied. "Another hour out there and, well, you're here now. That's what matters." As the evening wore on, the man, who introduced himself as Jonas, regained some of his strength. He was a traveler, a tradesman by the look of his worn boots and sturdy pack. He'd been heading to the next village when the storm overtook him, forcing him off the path. "You've saved me," Jonas said, his voice steadier now as he sipped the tea Martha had made. "I wouldn't have made it another step." Martha shook her head. "The inn has always been a place of refuge. That's its purpose." Jonas studied her, his eyes sharp despite his exhaustion. "And what about you? You're here alone?" "For the most part," Martha said, her tone light. "But I've found that the company comes when it's needed." That night the storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling against the shutters. Martha checked on Jonas frequently, ensuring he stayed warm and comfortable. He slept fitfully, his breath shallow but steady. As she sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance, her thoughts turned to her husband. How many storms had they weathered together, both literal and figurative? She opened her diary and began to write. January 22nd. Today, the storm brought a stranger to the inn, a man named Jonas, wounded and lost in the snow. He reminded me of the fragility of our journeys, how easily we can lose our way. But even in the harshest storms, there is always a place to find shelter, always a way to keep going. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving the world buried in fresh snow that sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. Jonas was stronger now, though he still moved gingerly. He insisted on helping Martha with the morning chores, carrying firewood and shoveling snow despite her protests. "You've already done enough for me," Jonas said, his tone firm. "Let me repay you, even just a little." Martha smiled, watching as he worked. It had been a long time since someone had shared the load, even briefly. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have that kind of partnership again, a small but persistent ache in her heart. When Jonas was ready to leave, he stood at the door, his pack slung over his shoulder. "Thank you, Martha," he said. "You've given me more than shelter. You've reminded me of the kindness that still exists in the world." "That's what the Hearthkeeper's Inn is for," Martha replied. "Take care of yourself, Jonas, and don't push too hard until that wound heals." He nodded, tipping his hat before stepping out into the snow. Martha watched as his figure disappeared down the path, the quiet of the forest returning once more. As she closed the door and turned back to the warmth of the hearth, Martha felt a sense of fulfillment that had eluded her in recent years. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, a reminder of the strength found in connection, however fleeting. That evening, she sat by the fire with her diary. January 23rd. Jonas left today, the storm having cleared enough for safe travel. I watched him go, a part of me hoping he finds what he's searching for. The inn has seen so many travelers pass through its doors, each carrying their own burdens, and yet, every time, it feels as though they leave something behind, a piece of their story, woven into the fabric of this place. The fire burned low as Martha closed the diary. Outside, the snow glowed softly beneath the moonlight, and the inn stood as it always had, a haven in the heart of the wilderness, waiting for the next story to find its way inside. Whispers of the Pines. The pines surrounding the Hearthkeeper's Inn stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with the remnants of the recent storm. The snow had eased, but the cold lingered, the air crisp and still. Martha found herself drawn to the forest more than usual, taking her morning tea out to the edge of the path where the inn's garden met the trees. There was something comforting in their steadfastness, a quiet strength that echoed through the landscape. It was on one such morning, as Martha watched a squirrel dart between the trees, that a figure appeared on the path. The woman walked with measured steps, her frame small but sturdy beneath a heavy wool coat. A wide-brimmed hat, dusted with snow, shaded her face. Slung over her shoulder was a leather satchel, the edges worn smooth from years of use. Martha set her mug down and approached. "Good morning," she called. "Can I help you?" The woman looked up, her face breaking into a warm, lined smile. "Good morning to you," she said, her voice light but firm. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I was told there's an inn here, and I'd very much appreciate a place to stay for a day or two." "You found it?" Martha said, gesturing toward the door. "Come in and warm yourself. It's colder than it looks out here." Once inside, the woman shed her coat and hat, revealing a head of silver hair neatly braided and tucked beneath a scarf. She introduced herself as Eleanor, a botanist traveling through the Highlands to study the region's unique flora. Her voice carried an enthusiasm that belied her years, and her sharp eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room. "You have a lovely inn," Eleanor said, settling into a chair by the fire. "And such a perfect location, so close to the forest. The pines here are ancient, you know, older than most of the trees in this part of the world." Martha nodded, handing her a mug of tea. "I've always thought they had a certain presence about them." "Presence is the right word," Eleanor agreed. "They hold the memory of this land that changes its scene. If you know how to listen, they'll tell you stories." Martha smiled, intrigued by the woman's passion. "I'd like to hear those stories someday." "Perhaps you will," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. "But first, you have to spend time with the trees. They reveal themselves slowly, like all the best storytellers." The next morning, Eleanor set out into the forest with her satchel and notebook. Martha watched her from the window as she moved among the trees, pausing often to examine a cluster of needles or the texture of bark. The sight stirred something in Martha, a curiosity, a desire to know the land as deeply as Eleanor seemed to. When Eleanor returned later that afternoon, her cheeks pink from the cold and her satchel bulging with samples, she found Martha waiting with tea and a plate of freshly baked scones. "You're very kind," Eleanor said, sitting down at the table. "I'll admit it's nice to return to such comfort after a day in the cold." Martha poured the tea, her curiosity getting the better of her. "What did you find out there?" Eleanor's face lit up as she opened her satchel, producing a few pine cones, sprigs of needles, and a small lichen-covered branch. She placed them carefully on the table, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent years studying the natural world. "These pines are fascinating," she said, her voice animated. "They've adapted to the harsh conditions here, growing slowly but steadily, their roots reaching deep into the rocky soil. Each tree is like a living archive, holding centuries of history." Martha picked up one of the pine cones, turning it over in her hands. "And what does that history tell us?" "That resilience isn't about speed," Eleanor said. "It's about patience. These trees have survived storms, droughts, and changes we can only imagine. They endure by staying rooted." Over the next 2 days, Eleanor shared more of her knowledge, weaving tales of the forest that left Martha in quiet awe. She spoke of the symbiotic relationships between plants and animals, the way fungi created underground networks that allowed trees to communicate, and the subtle ways the forest renewed itself each season. Martha found herself drawn to Eleanor's perspective. It was as if the woman saw the world through a lens that magnified its quiet beauty, revealing patterns and connections most people overlooked. On Eleanor's last evening at the inn, the two women sat by the fire, the table between them littered with pine sprigs and pages of notes. The conversation turned reflective, the warmth of the hearth creating a space for deeper thoughts. "You've spent so much time here in this inn," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "Do you ever feel like the pines, that you're rooted to this place?" Martha paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. "I suppose I do," she said after a moment. "There are times when it feels confining, but more often it feels like home. Like this is where I'm meant to be." Eleanor nodded. "That's a gift, you know, to have a place where you belong." Martha smiled, her heart warmed by the words. And you? Do you feel rooted with all your traveling? My roots are in the knowledge I carry, Eleanor said, in the connections I make with the world around me. But sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find a place to rest. You're always welcome here, Martha said sincerely, for as long as you need. Eleanor's smile was soft, touched with gratitude. Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know. The next morning, Eleanor packed her satchel and prepared to leave. Before she stepped out into the snowy path, she handed Martha a small journal. For you, she said. It's empty, meant to be filled with your own observations. Spend time with the pines, Martha. You might be surprised at what they teach you. Martha accepted the journal, her fingers brushing over its leather cover. I'll treasure it, she said. Safe travels, Eleanor. Eleanor tipped her hat and disappeared into the forest, her figure soon swallowed by the towering trees. That evening, Martha sat by the fire, the small journal in her lap. She opened her own diary and began to write. January 30th. Eleanor left today, but she's given me much to think about. Her stories of the forest, of the resilience of the pines, have stayed with me. Perhaps she's right. There are lessons to be learned in the stillness of the trees. I think I'll take her advice and spend more time among them. They feel like old friends I've only just begun to know. The fire crackled softly as Martha closed the diary. Outside, the pines stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. They seemed to hum with quiet wisdom, inviting her to listen. The Harvest Feast. February gave way to March, and the snow began its slow retreat, revealing patches of dark, damp earth beneath. The air softened with the promise of spring, though frost still crept over the windows of the Hearthkeeper's inn on cold mornings. The forest paths remained muddy, and the streams swelled with melted snow, their gentle murmur a song of renewal. Martha was preparing the hearth for the day when she heard the sound of wheels crunching on the gravel path outside. Setting down the poker, she stepped to the window and saw a horse-drawn wagon pulling up to the inn. A family of 5 was climbing down, their faces pink from the cold but bright with excitement. At the center of it all was a tall man with a booming laugh, his voice carrying even through the closed windows. She opened the door as they approached, her warm smile greeting them. "Welcome to the Hearthkeeper's Inn," she said. "Come in and get warm." The man doffed his cap, his grin as wide as his shoulders. "Thank you kindly, ma'am. Name's Owen, and these are my wife, Margaret, and our children, Henry, Clara, and little Rose." Each child waved shyly as he introduced them. "We're on our way to the harvest fair in the village, but thought we'd stop here for the night." "You're just in time, then," Martha replied, stepping aside to let them in. "The fair is a wonderful event, and you're welcome to stay as long as you like." The family brought with them a lively energy that filled the inn, their laughter and chatter weaving through the quiet halls. The children marveled at the large hearth, and Margaret admired the rows of books that lined the shelves. Owen regaled Martha with tales of his farm, how the harsh winter had threatened their crops, but how through perseverance they had managed a small but promising yield. "Enough to take to the fair," Owen said, his chest puffing with pride. "We'll sell what we can and bring back what we need for planting." "That's the spirit of the season," Martha said, her tone warm. "Renewal and growth." That evening, Martha decided to host a dinner in honor of her guests. She lit candles along the mantel and set the table with her best linens, filling the room with a soft glow. The children helped gather pine cones and sprigs of evergreen from the garden, which they arranged into a simple centerpiece. The meal was a feast of comfort: roasted vegetables, fresh bread from the village, and a steaming pot of stew that filled the air with savory warmth. For dessert, Martha served an apple tart she'd baked earlier in the day, its golden crust dusted with cinnamon. As they ate, the conversation turned to the fair. "You'll hear music all day long," Owen said, his hands gesturing animatedly. "Fiddles, flutes, and sometimes even a harp. There's dancing in the square, and the smell of roasted nuts and honey cakes fills the air." "And there's a storyteller," Clara chimed in, her young voice bubbling with excitement. "He wears a big hat with a feather and tells the most wonderful tales." "That sounds magical," Martha said, her smile widening as she watched their enthusiasm. "You should come with us," Margaret said, her kind eyes meeting Martha's. "A woman like you deserves to enjoy the festivities." Martha hesitated, her heart warming at the offer. "Perhaps I will," she said, her voice soft. "It's been a long time since I've been to the fair." After dinner, Owen and Henry insisted on helping clear the table while the younger children played near the hearth. Margaret sat with Martha, their conversation turning more personal as the firelight danced around them. "You've made this place feel like home," Margaret said, her tone filled with admiration. "It must take such strength to keep it running on your own." Martha smiled, her hands resting in her lap. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it. The inn gives me purpose, and it brings people like you through my doors." Margaret reached out and placed a hand on Martha's. "If you ever need help, don't hesitate to ask. Community is what keeps us all going." Martha nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a great deal." The next morning, the family prepared to leave for the fair, their wagon loaded with baskets of preserves, bundles of herbs, and jars of honey. Before they departed, Owen handed Martha a small jar filled with amber liquid. "A little something from our bees," he said with a wink, "to sweeten your tea on cold mornings." Martha accepted the gift with a smile. "Thank you, Owen. Safe travels, and enjoy the fair." The children waved as the wagon disappeared down the path, their laughter echoing through the trees. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha sat by the hearth with her diary. The room still carried the warmth of the family's presence, the pine cone centerpiece a reminder of their visit. She opened the jar of honey and stirred a spoonful into her tea, the golden liquid catching the firelight. March 15th. Today, the inn was alive with laughter and light. Owen and his family brought with them a spirit of joy that reminded me of the beauty in shared meals and simple kindness. The harvest fair calls to me. I can hear it in their stories and see it in their excitement. Perhaps it's time for me to step beyond the walls of the inn, if only for a day. The tea was sweet and soothing, and as Martha closed the diary, she felt a quiet anticipation stir within her. The inn had given her so much, but perhaps it was time to let the world beyond its doors offer her something in return. Letters left behind. The days grew warmer, and with the slow retreat of winter, the forest paths surrounding the Hearthkeeper's inn softened underfoot, rich with the scent of thawing earth. A gentle rhythm had settled over Martha's days, tending the garden, preparing meals, and welcoming the occasional traveler who sought rest within the inn's walls. The stillness now felt less like solitude and more like a gentle pause in life's busy current. It was on a particularly bright morning. with the sun streaming through the windows and birdsong filling the air, that a knock sounded at the inn's door. Martha set aside the book she'd been reading and opened the door to find an elderly man standing on the porch, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and kind beneath the brim of his hat. "Good morning," he said, tipping the hat slightly. "I hope I'm not intruding, but the road has been longer than I expected. Might you have room for an old postman?" Martha smiled warmly. "You're always welcome here. Come in and make yourself comfortable." The man introduced himself as Samuel, a retired postmaster who had spent decades delivering letters across the countryside. Now, in his later years, he traveled for pleasure, revisiting the towns and villages he had once known so well. He carried with him an air of quiet purpose, as though his journey held secrets only he could decipher. Over tea, Samuel shared snippets of his life, a life spent in service, delivering not just mail but pieces of people's lives. "Letters are funny things," he said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into his cup. "They carry so much more than words. Hopes, fears, love, regret, they're all tucked away in those envelopes, waiting to be opened." Martha nodded, intrigued. "And did you ever wonder about the stories behind them?" "Always," Samuel said with a chuckle. "But it wasn't my place to pry. My job was to deliver them, not to read them." He reached into his bag and pulled out a bundle of yellowed envelopes, tied neatly with a piece of twine. "Except for these," he added, his tone softening. "These were letters that were never claimed. They've been sitting in the old post office for years, forgotten and undelivered. When I retired, I couldn't bear to leave them behind." Martha leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "And now?" "Now I carry them with me," Samuel said. "I like to imagine where they might have gone, who might have written them. It's like carrying a little library of untold stories." That evening, after a warm supper by the fire, Samuel asked if Martha would like to read one of the letters. "It's better to share the stories," he said, "even if they're incomplete." Martha hesitated, then nodded. Samuel untied the bundle and handed her an envelope. The handwriting on the front was elegant, though faded, and the address was smudged and unreadable. With care, Martha opened the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Anna, the days grow longer, but my heart remains heavy with your absence. The garden is beginning to bloom, though it seems less vibrant without you here to tend it. I've left a space by the gate for your roses. I couldn't bring myself to plant them without you. Come home soon, my love. This place feels incomplete without you. Yours always, James." The room was quiet as Martha finished reading, the words lingering in the air like the faint scent of roses. She folded the letter and placed it gently back into the envelope. "Did Anna ever return, I wonder?" she said softly. "That's the mystery," Samuel replied. "But the beauty of letters like these is that they let us imagine. Perhaps she did, and they lived a long, happy life together. Or perhaps she never made it back, and this letter is all that remains of their love." Martha nodded, her heart stirring with a mix of longing and warmth. "It's a reminder, isn't it, of how much we leave unsaid, even when we think we have time." The next morning, Samuel prepared to leave, his bag slung over his shoulder once more. Before he stepped out onto the path, he handed Martha one of the letters. "For you," he said. "You've given me a place to rest, and I think this letter belongs here now. Perhaps it will inspire you to write your own stories." Martha accepted the letter, her fingers brushing over the worn envelope. Thank you, Samuel. Safe travels, and may you find the stories you're searching for. Samuel tipped his hat and set off down the path, his figure soon disappearing into the trees. That evening, Martha sat by the hearth, the letter resting on her lap. She didn't open it right away, letting its presence fill the room with a quiet sense of possibility. When she finally did unfold the paper, the words felt like a gift, a glimpse into a life she would never know but could somehow still feel connected to. She opened her diary and began to write. March 28th. Today, Samuel left the inn, but he left behind more than just the warmth of his company. The letters he carried were a reminder of the connections we make and the words we leave behind. They are fragments of lives, tucked into envelopes, waiting to be heard. I think I'll start writing more often, not just in this diary, but to the people who matter. Time is fleeting, and words are a gift. The fire crackled softly as Martha closed the diary. Outside, the pines swayed gently in the evening breeze, their branches whispering secrets of their own. And within the inn, the warmth of shared stories lingered, filling the quiet with a sense of peace. A quilt of stories. The Hearthkeeper's inn had grown quieter with the arrival of April, its halls filled only with the soft hum of Martha's daily routine. The snow had melted, and the garden was slowly coming to life, with green shoots pushing through the thawed soil. The days were longer now, the light stretching into the evenings, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold. Martha was in the kitchen preparing tea when she heard the sound of a carriage approaching. Setting the kettle down, she moved to the window and saw a group of women climbing out, their laughter carried by the breeze. Each carried a bag or bundle, and their faces were bright with the energy of shared purpose. Opening the door, Martha greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Hearthkeeper's Inn," she said. "What brings you all this way?" A tall woman with silver hair stepped forward, her hand extended in greeting. "I'm Lydia," she said. "We're part of a quilting group, and we've come for a weekend retreat. The village tailor mentioned your inn, and it sounded like the perfect place for a bit of inspiration." Martha's smile widened. "You've come to the right place. Please come in." The women, 6 in total, filled the inn with their lively chatter as they unpacked their supplies in the sitting room. Bolts of fabric, spools of thread, and intricate patterns spilled across the tables, transforming the space into a temporary workshop. Martha brought them tea and biscuits, listening as they discussed their plans. "We're each working on a quilt," Lydia explained, "but the idea is that they all connect in some way. A patchwork of shared stories." Another woman, younger with fiery red hair, chimed in. "It's like creating a tapestry of our lives. Each piece represents a memory, a person, or a place that's shaped us." Martha found herself enchanted by the idea. "That sounds beautiful," she said, "a way to carry your stories with you." "Exactly," Lydia said with a smile. "And you're welcome to join us if you'd like." Martha hesitated, her hands brushing against her apron. "I haven't quilted in years. My grandmother taught me when I was young, but I was never very good at it." "That doesn't matter," Lydia said gently. "It's not about perfection, it's about connection." Over the next 2 days, the inn was alive with the sound of scissors snipping, thread pulling through fabric, and the women's voices weaving stories as they worked. Martha found herself drawn into their circle, sitting with a scrap of fabric in her hands and slowly stitching her own piece. The women shared tales from their lives, each story reflected in the patterns they chose. One woman stitched a square of bright yellow to represent the sunflower fields of her childhood. Another added a piece of plaid from her father's old shirt, a tribute to his memory. The youngest of the group worked on a piece with vibrant blues and greens, inspired by her travels to distant shores. As Martha stitched, she thought of the inn, its quiet strength, its role as a shelter and a home for stories. She chose a piece of deep burgundy fabric from her grandmother's old apron, pairing it with a soft gray that reminded her of the mist that often enveloped the valley. "This is for the hearth," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "and for the light it brings." The retreat wasn't all work, of course. In the evenings, the women gathered by the fire, their laughter and shared memories filling the inn with warmth. Martha prepared hearty meals for them, and after dinner, they took turns reading from the books on the shelves or singing old folk songs that echoed through the halls. On the final evening, Lydia stood and held up her finished quilt. The pieces came together in a breathtaking display of colors and textures, each one telling a unique story. She spread it out on the table, and the other women followed suit, their quilts forming a patchwork of lives and memories. Martha's square was small, but the women insisted on stitching it into Lydia's quilt, saying it belonged among their stories. "It's part of the inn now," Lydia said with a smile, "and the inn is part of us." The next morning, as the women packed their supplies and prepared to leave, Lydia handed Martha a small bundle wrapped in fabric. "For you," she said, "a reminder that stories are meant to be shared." Inside was a set of quilting needles and a collection of fabric scraps, each one chosen for its connection to the weekend they had shared. Martha held the bundle close, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing so much life to this place." "You've given us a home for our stories," Lydia replied. "That's a gift we won't forget." After the women had gone, the inn felt quiet again, but not empty. The memories of the retreat lingered, like the scent of lavender and pine that drifted through the open windows. Martha sat by the hearth that evening, the bundle of fabric scraps beside her, and opened her diary. April 8th. This weekend, the inn became a haven for stories woven in fabric and thread. Lydia and her group reminded me of the power of connection, the way our lives intertwine, creating something greater than ourselves. The quilt they left behind holds a piece of the inn and a piece of me. I think I'll start my own quilt, one that tells the story of this place and the people who pass through its doors. The fire crackled softly as Martha closed the diary. She picked up a piece of burgundy fabric from the bundle and ran her fingers over its texture, imagining the quilt she would one day create. Outside, the first blossoms of spring were beginning to appear, their delicate petals reaching toward the light. The Lost Traveler's Map. The first truly warm day of spring arrived with golden sunlight spilling through the trees and casting soft shadows across the Hearthkeeper's inn. The garden outside the inn was beginning to bloom, and the air carried a hint of earth and fresh greenery. Martha spent the morning tending to the flower beds, her hands deep in the soil, when she heard the distant creak of a cart approaching along the forest path. Setting aside her trowel, she rose and dusted her hands on her apron, peering down the path. A man in a wide-brimmed hat sat atop a rickety wooden cart pulled by a small, tired-looking horse. The cart was piled high with rolled maps and surveying tools, their brass edges catching the sunlight. As the man drew nearer, he waved, a broad smile brightening his weathered face. "Good day to you, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the breeze. "Would this be the Hearthkeeper's inn?" "It is," Martha replied, stepping forward to greet him. "And you're very welcome here." The man introduced himself as Ewan, a cartographer traveling through the Highlands to create a new map of the region. His work, he explained over tea, was part artistry, part science, and entirely driven by a love of the land. "I've spent most of my life wandering," he said, his fingers tracing the edge of the teacup. "Every map I've drawn is like a journal of my journeys, a way to leave something behind." "And the map you're working on now?" Martha asked, her curiosity piqued. "What will it show?" "The valleys, the forests, the streams, all of it," Ewan replied. "But I'm looking for something more this time. Not just the land as it is, but the stories it holds, the places that matter to the people who live here." Martha tilted her head, intrigued. "You want to map the heart of the land, not just its surface." "Exactly," Ewan said, his smile widening. "But it's no small task." Over the next few days, Ewan made the inn his base of operations, venturing out each morning with his tools and returning in the evenings with new sketches and notes. Martha found herself drawn to his process, watching as he spread his work across the dining table, his pencil flying over the paper with a precision born of years of practice. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ewan unrolled one of his earlier maps for Martha to see. It was detailed and beautiful, each line and curve capturing the contours of the land with remarkable accuracy. "This one is of a valley to the south," he said, pointing to a winding river that snaked through the parchment. "But look closer." Martha leaned in and noticed tiny symbols scattered across the map. Stars, trees, and small circles. "What are these?" she asked. "Stories," Ewan replied. "The star marks where a traveler once saw an unexplainable light in the sky. The tree is for a spot where a couple carved their initials into the bark a century ago. And the circles, those are the villages where I've met people who've shared their lives with me." Martha ran her fingers over the paper, marveling at the layers of meaning hidden within the map. "It's like you've captured not just the land, but its soul." "That's the hope," Ewan said. "Every map is a way to preserve what might otherwise be forgotten." One morning, Ewan invited Martha to join him on one of his excursions. Together they walked along a narrow path that wound through the forest, Ewan stopping frequently to take measurements and jot down notes. He showed her how to use a compass and explained the intricacies of triangulation, his passion for his craft infectious. As they walked, Martha shared stories of the inn, of the travelers who had passed through its doors and the memories they had left behind. Ewan listened intently, occasionally sketching small symbols in the corner of his notebook. "This place," he said as they paused near a stream, "it deserves to be remembered. Not just as a location, but as a part of the lives it's touched." Martha smiled, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm blanket. "It's strange," she said softly. "I've always thought of the inn as a place where stories begin and end, but maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's part of the story itself." That evening, back at the inn, Ewan spread out his work on the dining table. Among the sketches was a rough map of the forest surrounding the inn, its paths and clearings marked with delicate lines. In one corner, he had drawn a small symbol, a simple hearth, its flames curling upward. "That's for you," he said, tapping the symbol with his pencil. "The inn, a place of warmth and light." Martha's eyes softened as she studied the map. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing it the way I do." Ewan smiled. "It's a gift, but it's also the truth." When Ewan's work in the area was complete, he prepared to move on, his cart once again piled high with rolled maps and tools. Before he left, he handed Martha a small folded piece of parchment. "It's not much," he said. "Just a little map of the inn and its surroundings. A token of gratitude for the kindness you've shown me." Martha unfolded the parchment and saw the inn rendered in delicate lines, the forest paths radiating outward like veins from a heart. In one corner he had written in flowing script, "The Hearthkeeper's Inn, a shelter for stories." "It's beautiful," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it always." Ewan tipped his hat, his expression kind. "And I'll carry the memory of this place with me wherever I go." That evening, Martha placed the map on the mantel above the hearth, its edges weighted down with smooth river stones. As she sat with her diary, the room filled with the quiet hum of the fire, she began to write. April 20th. Ewan left today, but his map remains, a reminder that this inn is more than just a building. It is a point on the map of many lives, a place where stories converge and radiate outward. I'll carry his words with me, a shelter for stories. That is what this place has always been, and what it will always be. The fire crackled softly as Martha closed the diary. Outside, the forest stretched into the night, its paths illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. And within the Hearthkeeper's Inn, the warmth of the stories it had gathered lingered, ready to welcome the next traveler. The winter solstice. The calendar had turned back toward the darker months, and the first snowfall of December blanketed the valley in a pristine white hush. The Hearthkeeper's Inn, with its sturdy stone walls and glowing windows, seemed to embrace the season, standing as a beacon of warmth against the chill. The pine trees surrounding the inn were dusted with snow, their boughs heavy and still. Martha had been busy that morning, preparing for the winter solstice, a tradition she had come to cherish over the years. The day marked not just the longest night of the year, but a turning point, a quiet celebration of light in the midst of darkness. This year, she planned to light candles throughout the inn, their soft glow symbolizing the promise of brighter days ahead. As she was setting the last of the evergreen garlands on the mantel, a knock at the door echoed through the quiet. Martha hurried to open it, her breath catching at the sight of a family huddled together against the cold. A man, a woman, and two young boys stood on the porch, their faces pink from the frost. "Good evening," the man said, his voice warm despite his shivering. "We were on our way to the village for the solstice celebration, but the snow is heavier than we expected. Could we possibly stay the night?" "Of course," Martha said, stepping aside to let them in. "You're welcome to join my celebration here." The woman, whose name was Elaine, smiled gratefully as she helped the boys out of their coats. "Thank you," she said. "This place feels like a gift in the middle of the storm." Martha busied herself preparing a meal while the family warmed themselves by the fire. The boys, curious and full of energy, explored the sitting room, marveling at the books and the garlands. Elaine joined Martha in the kitchen, her voice soft as they chatted. "This isn't what we planned," Elaine admitted, "but it feels right. The solstice is about finding light, isn't it? And we found it here." Martha smiled, her heart warmed by the sentiment. "That's exactly how I feel. This inn has always been a place for light, even in the darkest times." As the evening deepened, Martha gathered her guests in the sitting room. The table was set with simple but hearty fare, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a rich stew that filled the room with its savory aroma. At each place she had set a small beeswax candle, unlit for now. Before the meal, Martha invited everyone to share a thought, a memory, or a wish for the coming year. The boys spoke excitedly about snowball fights and sledding, their laughter filling the room. Elaine and her husband Robert spoke of gratitude, for family, for health, and for the kindness of strangers. When it was Martha's turn, she paused, her hands resting lightly on the table. "I'm grateful for this inn," she said softly, "for the people it brings through its doors and the stories they leave behind. And for nights like this, when the warmth of company reminds me that even the longest night has its light." With that, she lit her candle, passing the flame to Elaine, who lit the next, until the entire table was aglow with the soft flicker of light. The room seemed to breathe with warmth, the shadows on the walls dancing as if alive. After the meal, the family and Martha moved to the hearth, where the boys insisted on hearing a story. Martha, a little unsure at first, began recounting the tale of a solstice past, a story of a traveler who found his way to the inn during a storm, much like this one, his life forever changed by the kindness he encountered. Her voice, steady and warm, wove the tale as the fire crackled beside her. The boys leaned forward, their eyes wide, while Elaine and Robert listened with quiet smiles. By the time Martha finished, the room was hushed, the glow of the hearth enveloping them all. When the children had gone to bed and the fire had burned low, Elaine approached Martha, her expression thoughtful. "You've created something rare here," she said. "A place where people feel safe, where they can be themselves. That's a kind of light all its own." Martha felt her cheeks flush, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than I can say." The next morning, the storm had eased, and the family prepared to continue their journey to the village. As they stood on the porch ready to leave, Elaine pressed a small bundle into Martha's hands. "It's just a little something," Elaine said, "a reminder of this night." Inside the bundle was a beautifully carved wooden star, its edges smooth and polished. Martha held it carefully, her eyes misting. "Thank you," she said. "I'll treasure this." "You've already given us more than we could repay," Elaine replied. "This inn, it's magic." That evening, as the stars began to pierce the dark winter sky, Martha hung the wooden star above the hearth. Its polished surface caught the firelight, casting a soft glow that filled the room. She sat down with her diary and began to write. December 21st. The winter solstice brought a family to the inn tonight, filling it with light and laughter. Their presence reminded me of what this place is meant to be, a haven in the darkness, a gathering of warmth and stories. The longest night has passed, and with it comes the promise of brighter days ahead. The light we carry is enough to see us through. As Martha closed the diary, the wooden star above the hearth gleamed softly, a quiet reminder of the night's warmth. Outside, the snow-covered valley stretched into the stillness. But within the Hearthkeeper's inn, the light burned brightly, ready to welcome the next story. Threads of the Past. As January deepened, the snow returned in soft flurries that blanketed the valley and frosted the edges of the forest. The Hearthkeeper's inn stood strong against the winter chill, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth within. Martha had settled into a quiet rhythm, her days filled with tending the hearth and journaling the stories of those who had passed through her door. It was on a particularly clear morning, with sunlight glittering on the snow, that a knock at the door broke the stillness. Martha opened it to find a man standing on the porch, wrapped in a long coat and carrying a satchel. His spectacles were fogged from the cold, and his hat was dusted with snow. "Good morning," he said, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm a historian, Samuel Blake, and I've come to the Highlands to research local folklore. Might you have a room for a few days?" "You've come to the right place," Martha said, stepping aside to let him in. "The inn has its fair share of history and plenty of warmth to offer." Over tea, Samuel explained his work. He was gathering stories and legends from the area for a book he hoped to write, a project born from his fascination with the ways in which places held memories. "The Highlands are rich with tales," he said, his voice animated. "From the ancient clans to the simple lives of villagers, every hill and hollow seems to whisper its own story." Martha nodded, intrigued. "And what about this inn? Have you heard any whispers from these walls?" Samuel smiled, his eyes bright behind his glasses. "Not yet, but I suspect it has its secrets." The next morning, Samuel set up his work in the sitting room, spreading papers and old maps across the table. He pored over them with a scholar's focus, occasionally jotting notes in the margins. Martha watched from the kitchen, a quiet curiosity blooming within her. She had always thought of the inn as a practical place, a shelter, a home. But Samuel's perspective made her wonder about the stories its stones might hold. "Have you ever thought about its history?" Samuel asked her later, as they shared a simple lunch of soup and bread. "Not deeply," Martha admitted. "I know my grandparents built it, but beyond that, it's just been a place for people to come and go." Samuel leaned forward. His interest piqued. "May I explore? I'd like to see if there are any clues to its past tucked away." Martha hesitated, but then nodded. "Feel free. There's an attic full of old things, if you're willing to brave the dust." That afternoon, the two of them climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, where the air was cool and faintly musty. Boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating the room in a golden haze. Samuel opened a trunk near the center, his movements careful. Inside were old linens, faded photographs, and a bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine. He picked up the papers, his expression one of quiet awe. "These look like letters," he said, holding them up for Martha to see. Martha's breath caught as she reached for them. The handwriting was elegant, though faded, and the paper was brittle to the touch. She read aloud from the first letter. "Dearest Evelyn, the inn stands finished, its walls strong against the winds, and its hearth warm with promise. I hope it will be a home not just for us, but for the many who will come seeking rest. It is my gift to you, and to the stories we will create together." Martha's voice faltered as she finished the letter, her eyes misting. "This was written by my grandfather," she said softly. "To my grandmother." Samuel nodded, his expression reverent. "It's a treasure, Martha, a glimpse into the heart of this place." They continued exploring, uncovering more letters, old journals, and even a set of blueprints for the inn. Each discovery painted a richer picture of the inn's origins, its purpose as a sanctuary, its role as a gathering place for travelers and storytellers alike. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Martha and Samuel spread their findings across the table. Together, They pieced together the story of the inn's creation, how her grandparents had dreamed of a place where the weary could find rest, how they had built it stone by stone with their own hands, and how they had filled it with warmth and light for all who entered. "It's more than just a building," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful. "It's a living legacy. Every traveler who's passed through its doors has added a thread to its story." Martha nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "And it's still growing," she said, "with every person who finds their way here." On Samuel's last night at the inn, he presented Martha with a bound copy of his notes. "This is for you," he said, "a record of the inn's past. It deserves to be remembered." Martha accepted the book, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Samuel, for showing me what this place truly is." "It's been my honor," Samuel replied, "and I hope you'll keep adding to its story." After Samuel left, Martha spent the evening by the hearth, the letters and journals spread around her. She read each one carefully, letting the words of her grandparents fill the room with their love and purpose. When she finally opened her diary, her thoughts flowed easily onto the page. January 15th. Today I learned the true history of this inn, the dreams and love that built it, the purpose it was meant to serve. It is more than walls and a hearth. It is a place where stories converge, where the threads of the past weave into the present. I feel honored to be its caretaker, and I will carry its legacy forward with pride. The fire burned low as Martha closed the diary. Above the hearth, the wooden star from the winter solstice gleamed softly, a symbol of light and connection. Outside, the snow fell gently, but within the inn, the warmth of its stories burned brightly, ready for the next chapter. A Hearthkeeper's reflection. The final days of winter lingered at the Hearthkeeper's inn, the snow melting slowly under the pale warmth of early spring sunlight. The pines swayed gently in the cool breeze, their needles whispering a song that Martha had come to think of as a lullaby for the land. Inside the inn, the fire burned steadily, its glow casting flickering patterns on the walls as Martha sat at the long oak table, her diary open before her. It had been over a year since she decided to open the diary, to capture the stories of those who passed through the inn's doors. Now its pages were full. Tales of travelers and neighbors, of unexpected kindness and shared meals, of laughter and sometimes of tears. Each entry was a thread in the tapestry of the inn's life, a reflection of the role it played in the lives of so many. Martha flipped through the diary, pausing on a passage from her first entry. The snow came again today, blanketing the pines in thick, white silence. The inn feels so still, almost too quiet. I wonder who will be the next to arrive, and what story they will bring. She smiled to herself, marveling at how much had changed. The stillness she had once found heavy now felt like a pause between notes in a symphony, a necessary quiet that made the moments of connection all the more meaningful. The morning sunlight streamed through the window as Martha turned the pages, her heart warming at the memories captured within. There was Daniel, the writer who had reminded her of the joy of storytelling, Clara and Henry, who had found solace in the warmth of the inn during their grief, Hamish, whose music had rekindled her love for the piano, and Eleanor, who had taught her to see the wisdom of the pines. She lingered on the entry about the quilting group, remembering the laughter that had filled the inn as the women shared their stories through fabric and thread. She thought of Ewan, the cartographer, who had given her a map that still hung above the hearth, a reminder that the inn was not just a place, but a point on the map of many lives. Her gaze fell on the wooden star above the hearth, a gift from Elaine and her family during the winter solstice. It caught the light in a way that seemed almost alive, as though it held within it the warmth of that night. Martha rose and touched the star gently, her fingers tracing its smooth edges. "This place has its own kind of magic," she murmured. "Not in spells or enchantments, but in the connections it creates." As the day wore on, Martha prepared the inn for the coming season. She swept the floors, polished the banister, and added fresh flowers to the vases in the sitting room. The fire burned low in the hearth, its warmth filling the room as she brewed a pot of tea and sat down once more with her diary. For the final entry she paused, the weight of what she wanted to say settling over her like a gentle snow. When the words came, they flowed with ease, each one a reflection of the life she had built and the legacy she had come to understand. March 1st. The Hearthkeeper's Inn is more than a building. It is a place of light, of stories, of connection. It has seen the laughter of children and the quiet tears of travelers seeking solace. It has welcomed musicians and writers, dreamers and wanderers, each leaving a piece of themselves behind. And it has given me more than I could have imagined, a purpose, a community, and a sense of belonging. I have come to see that the inn is not just a shelter for others, it is a shelter for me too. To those who pass through its doors, I hope you find warmth, kindness, and a moment of peace. And to the stories yet to be written here, I look forward to welcoming you. The Hearthkeeper's Inn will always be a home for those who need it, and so it is for me. Martha closed the diary, her hands resting on its worn cover. She gazed around the room, her heart swelling with gratitude for the life she had built here, for the people she had met, and for the stories that had filled its walls. The fire crackled softly, the sound blending with the faint rustle of the pines outside. The inn was quiet now, but Martha knew it wouldn't be for long. The next story was always just a step away, waiting to cross the threshold. As she stood and placed the diary on the shelf beside the map and the wooden star, the sunlight streaming through the window caught the room in a golden glow. She smiled to herself, the warmth of the inn filling her heart as she moved to stoke the fire. The Hearthkeeper's Inn was ready, and so was she. Thank you for visiting Story Planet, where tales bring comfort and calm. If the Hearthkeeper's story warmed your heart, consider giving it a like and sharing it with those you treasure. Don't forget to subscribe for more relaxing and inspiring stories crafted just for you. Sweet dreams, and see you next time.